Hi, I'm Chris Hurd. Welcome to the Ahead of the Herd podcast, where we talk to buyers, investors, and sellers of tech about what's going on in tech. And today, have an awesome guest on. We've got Jackie DiMonte. Jackie is a close friend and also fantastic venture capitalist. Started out in enterprise tech for Deloitte, I believe. Went through the VC world in Hyde Park. Oh, it's Accenture. I got it wrong. Oh my
Yeah. Oh, man.
they're all the same. One of those four companies is on her resume. And then she went to Hyde Park, then she went to Chicago, and recently started her own fund. Jackie, so good to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Awesome. Apologies to Accenture. It's Accenture.
Yeah, I think they'll survive that hit.
Okay, good. Well, where in the world are you today, Jackie?
I'm in New York, and surprisingly, it feels as hot as Austin. So I am just trying to keep it cool.
That famous East Coast weather that's just nice for like 3 weeks of the year and then too hot and too cold.
Yeah, the humidity is just a killer.
Yeah. You're a big Texas fan, though. I mean, Texas has got to be pretty hot, too.
Texas is unbelievably hot. I used to liken Texas summers to Chicago winters. I grew up in Chicago. Um, Sometimes they're better because they're sunny versus like Chicago winters are just gray all the time. But man, they last really long.
Yeah, unnecessary. I was in Atlanta once in like June. I think it was June or July. Whatever month it was just unacceptable. And I had to run to every meeting. I got to every meeting like sweating. I looked awful. Every time I had a meeting, I just looked awful running
Yeah.
out of the car.
I mean, Atlanta's really got the humidity to go. Austin's got like a little bit more on the drier side. I think that makes it slightly more manageable. But yeah, Atlanta. I mean, I love Atlanta, but that humidity is a killer too.
I'm a Brit that lives in Canada, so I think I'll just stick with cold's good. I'm fine with the cold. All right, awesome. Well, we didn't give much of an intro onto Grid Capital. If you want to do a little pitch, let us know what you're doing with Grid Capital and your thesis and stuff, and then we can get into some important tech topics of the day.
Yeah. Well, Grid Capital, early stage venture fund. So, we're investing in seed and pre-seed companies, specialist, sort of run by Peter and myself, domain experts in the industrial software space. So think manufacturing, construction, supply chain, and we lead. We lead rounds. I think it's the best product for our investors and certainly the founders that we work with. So that's Grid in a nutshell.
That's awesome and actually really interesting. I've explored odd verticals in my career and selling to different groups, and I love the manufacturing focus and idea. What really drove you towards that vertical specifically?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is the stuff that Peter and I were doing before venture has always been in, the infrastructure, energy, more industrial space. So I think throughout our careers, we naturally tended towards those industries. But really, when it comes down to it from a venture perspective, we both cut our teeth in the Midwest. And you want to be investing in companies that are really set up to succeed where they're being built. And those tended to be manufacturing in the Midwest and Texas, construction across the Sun Belt, supply chain in, sort of Southeast and Midwest, things like that. So you really start to gravitate towards folks who have a right to win, right, in those categories.
Yeah. I love it. I almost find, do you find a different mentality for the founders of companies in these kind of industries versus maybe someone that was traditionally in software?
Yeah, I think especially for folks that are building in these categories, if you come from the industry, you tend to be a little bit more problem focused than solution focused. So I know we're going to talk about AI because how can you avoid AI these days? But I tend to see folks that have a software lens first, slap an AI on anything they can, versus founders kind of coming from these industries are saying like, look, we got to build a data set, right? Like I don't even have that. So I'm going to focus on the problem and then, sort of enhance our capabilities and value from there. So that's also a perspective that I really enjoy.
I love it. And I wonder if in those kind of industries, there are more problems that haven't yet been solved. I feel like sales tech, for example, like I think we've solved most of the problems in sales tech. We still continue to try to find problems, but within manufacturing, I've got a couple of friends who run like robotics companies, vision companies, and there's just so many problems that are still not being solved in those areas. Do you think this has got a bit of a long runway too?
I mean, I do. I think you're spot on. I think there's a lot of problems that have not been solved where they're counterparty problems, and maybe the horizontal or sort of more services industries, things like that have been solved. But I think there's two other sort of trends that are giving sort of this sector a lot of runway. One is just what's happening with skilled labor shortages, all of the sort of like nearshoring, onshoring trends, some of these geopolitical tensions that are sort of causing, especially in North America, to like beef up parts of these industries. So I think there's a big emphasis on, hey, we don't have enough people to do all the work that we need to do, so we're going to have to rely on technology to help us in some of those ways. So that's one. The other is, I think there's a lot more business model innovation that's going on.
Oh, cool.
The sort of traditional SaaS revenue model is hard for some of these sectors. Like, think about construction. If you're a subcontractor and you're on a project, you have cash flow. You can pay for software. You can do all these things. But when that project ends, if you have 2 or 3 weeks where you're not, working, you definitely don't want this sort of recurring payment, hitting your books. And so we're seeing a lot more on whether it's tech-enabled services or payments or transaction. People getting creative with like how to align incentives, which I think is also making customers much more likely to adopt those solutions when their vendor's business model sort of aligns with with theirs.
That's really interesting because I feel and we actually at Olive have the same issue with sort of RFPs, right? People, some people want it forever, and then occasionally, there's people that want to just do one massive RFP, and it's kind of the same sort of project-based move. I wonder if, I see so many times when I first got into software, it was a new business model, and people were excited about having subscription sometimes and not having that upfront capex, which was great. But then it feels like over the last sort of 5 or 6 years, we've been forcing customers into this payment, and you always have this pricing negotiation where it's like, no, you got to pay our way, even though it doesn't fit with what your use case is.
Mm-hmm.
Now it sounds like software companies are being forced to listen to the customer, interestingly enough, and say, okay, how do you want to pay, and how does that fit, and maybe I can shift my business model to fit that.
Totally. I mean, when I was working, so after Accenture, I worked at this company called Silver Spring Networks. It was sort of a hardware software company, largely powering IoT solutions for utilities and cities. So we made the chips that would go into, smart meters or distribution automation or streetlights. So you could understand what was going on across the grid, and then also be able to control and monitor and sort of create smarter operations around those. A lot of utilities are allowed to essentially get recompensated for capital X expenditures, but not OpEx. So, like, if they go to the state and they say, we need to raise our rates, they can really only raise their rates if they're making physical improvements on the grid. So we were offering a SaaS platform plus, the chips and the networking infrastructure and things like that. And a lot of the utilities were saying, no, we don't want that SaaS, but we'll physically buy the servers and then you can operate them. And so it was like a way to, sort of skirt some of these, like incentive problems. Is like, we have all of these layers of incentives and history and reasons for why we do the things that we do. And sometimes it's about like, how do we get creative in making sure that everyone's getting what they need out of the relationship.
I obviously I think it's great to be listening to customers. That's awesome. But as an investor, there's clearly a lack of predictability in that revenue model as well. So how do you balance that out, and how do you feel that the VC community is going to take that in terms of a shift from what has traditionally been such a predictable model to less
Yeah,
prediction?
I mean, I think there's predictability in model, and then there's sort of margin or cash flow potential. I think those are the two issues with, call it, non-SaaS business models in like the venture space. From a predictability perspective, I think this one is hard for a few reasons. One is seasonality or sort of exposure to macro volatility, right? Where you might have that in certain sectors and not as much in others. Kind of think about construction in, let's say, Chicago. Not a lot of it happening in December, a lot of it happening in June and July. So you might, like if you're doing more transactional based revenue, you might see some of that seasonality versus like, healthcare. If you sell, sort of a IT solution to a hospital, it's it's in and it's
Yeah.
it's sticking around no matter the time. So some of the things that we have to think about is like how do you get creative maybe in sort of volume based tiered pricing. There's a company I worked with that did sort of skilled labor recruitment for manufacturers, and it started off as very sort of tech enabled staffing, transactional things like that, and eventually they just shifted to, hey, however many open recs you have, we're going to put you on that tier, and that that'll be your payment method. So that was actually a way of like getting people onto the SaaS model. It's all about figuring out like how do we minimize that volatility, but also like make sure customers are comfortable. I think especially with AI getting incorporated into some of these business models too, your costs are so much more volume based. Like there's actually a cost to running software where like pre AI it's pretty darn low. It's like whatever your AWS bill is, and a few other things. So we're spending a lot of time, especially with founders that are sort of in that early stage where they've got like a design partner or two. It's figuring out like, okay, how do you think about ROI? Do you think about ROI in terms of like hours saved? Is it a revenue generator? Sort of like what are the levers as a customer you think about? And then how do we, sort of like translate that into our pricing? So that's one. And I think it's sometimes just like case by case basis. I don't think there's like sort of like hard rules around that. And then the other one is on, sort of like margins or cash flow. A lot of people don't like, hardware or sensors for this reason. Obviously tech-enabled services for this reason. What we want to see is the potential to create really large cash flows and have enough margin that you can reinvest in, sort of growth, product development, things like that. I think the extreme example of this is, like Amazon has notoriously low margins, but like such a great, like market size that it's all about the cash flow and like the scale of it. I'm not investing in that, but if you're at, 70%, gross margins versus like an 85, software, that might be okay. And it also might make you more valuable to your customers because you're providing a little bit more of this comprehensive service, right? Sometimes the SaaS platform does like 80% of the work for a customer, but that last 20% is really damn important to them. And so if you can augment some of those things with people, that might be better than just going to market with the SaaS platform with like great margins and a playbook that you know how to run. But like kind of doesn't fit, all of the requirements for your customers. So I think those are the things that like you really want to spend time on when you're thinking about some like atypical, revenue or business models for these companies.
It's really into the 20% too. If a customer doesn't want to do that 20%, then it doesn't matter you're doing the other 80% anyway. They're not going to go with it because I have to do the work. And I didn't hire you, so I still have to do a bunch of the work. That's it. Yeah, it's interesting that the business model is one of the things. We read a lot about software dying or SaaS is dead, etc. And I always assume it's AI, right? AI is killing software. But actually, maybe the business model is something that's undercurrent that we didn't even think about. Is maybe this business model isn't fit for everybody. And I also feel that there's a lot of companies out there, large and small, that leave a load of money on the table in search of the perfect dollar. They leave a lot of imperfect dollars on the table. And actually, if you focused on those, maybe you actually make more money with just selling to it's not perfect for you, but it's perfect for the customer. And then you're going to get more customers ultimately.
Yeah. It's like, it's a total balance of, what do you do in the beginning to learn and inform what is going to enable you to scale over the long term? And then how do you, from a venture perspective, how do you translate that narrative so that investors understand that's the transition that's happening? Because a lot of people, you get a lot of decks, you see something that doesn't align with your, viewpoint of the world, someone's going to just say, okay, no thanks. So it's a little bit about how do you really tell that story, and do you have that story? But yeah, I agree. I kind of think SaaS is dead, at least in terms of like where the potential is today versus where it was 10, 20 years ago. But software is not dead. Like, we still have so many problems, especially in some of these lagging industries. So many problems to solve that can be solved by augmenting, sort of humans with technology.
And maybe SaaS futures are dead, I think, is kind of the thing, right? SaaS is still going to exist, but maybe just the growth potential of SaaS is dead.
I think I'll put it another way. If you were starting a seed fund today, and I'm biased because like this is my whole shtick. Why would you go with like horizontal general B2B SaaS? You've got a lot of sort of incumbents from the investor perspective that have done really well here. They know the playbooks, and they're going to look for like the one or two things, right, that are still white space. Versus some of these verticals where it's like they don't even have systems of record, right? We're still going through that, or we're expecting 10% of our workforce to retire in the next 3 years, and like no one knows how to run these machines, right? Like there's some of these like very fundamental problems where it's like, if we don't solve this in the next couple of years, like the business will stop running the way it is today. Versus, to your point on sales tech, like how do we sort of like increase our conversion rates from by 3%, right? Like which is great. At a big enough scale, it hits the bottom line, or the top line, I guess. But it is just something that I think the big massive white space opportunity is a little bit less so there.
Yeah, we're looking at like incremental improvements of a Peloton, like in the background, versus Ozempic. Like I'll lose 20 pounds in a day. I'll do the Ozempic version. Not promoting Ozempic, but you get the picture.
Yeah.
So one of the things actually about construction, just switching tack from business models a little bit, I always think of, when I think of construction and manufacturing and tech, I think of robotics a lot. It feels like robotics is one of those areas that robotics generally tends to do well, because there is a necessity for robotics in that industry. And yet we still see robotics is taking forever. I mean, I remember, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was like, we're still working on solving the same problem. You're getting a lot of pitches from a lot of different companies. How much of it do you see is sort of hardware robotics in manufacturing? How much is software? How much is AI? What's that mix up, and where are people really investing in innovation in manufacturing construction?
Yeah, let's maybe limit this right now to manufacturing. I think manufacturing is such an interesting use case because it's both very it's lacking very fundamental technology, but also so advanced at the same time. Like the operations, the actual manufacturing is so advanced and needs to be respected, but there's also parts of it that are still like clipboard based. I think construction is a little bit harder on this side of things because in field robotics get much harder, right, when you have exposure to elements and things. There's stuff going on there, but like if we think about like things within a warehouse, so logistics, manufacturing, stuff like that. Robotics is something that we see a lot, but it tends to be a little bit more on like the decision making, the orchestration. Maybe like how do you do these like really intricate tasks? How do you allocate resources around? Everything has AI in it these days. If it doesn't, you're kind of like worried a little bit. Not that AI is like the core part of the technology, but let's say you're creating something that I don't know, helps people do quality assurance, right? At the end of a line. Maybe there's some workflow part to it, which is like, okay, pick up the iPad. These are the things you need to check, blah, blah, blah. But like, if you're not thinking about like who's going to start automating parts of this, like you're going to let yourself, remain open to exposure. I actually think the reason why we haven't fully automated a lot of these, sort of like production lines, things like that. One, they're complex, but two, you can't just trust robots to do everything, right? Like I have a very firm belief that especially AI, is not here to replace skilled labor in especially industrials, but you can think about like healthcare. A lot of these industries that are very much reliant on skilled people and workers who know their job and know their even take it down from like what would be sort of like your job title level to like the very specific types of patients or types of machines or machines specifically that you work with. Like there's a lot of innate knowledge there. So I think about what job is the AI doing for that person? Is it just assisting you on things, right? Like if you forget something, it tells you like, hey, you forgot this part, like make sure you install it. Is it augmenting what you're doing? So like you might set up a station and then a robot does the final tweaks, but the robot isn't really capable of doing some more of the human element. It might learn from you over time and be able to take on more and more of the task. Or does it, sort of like fully automate and humans are no longer in the loop? And I think some of these things are based on either how difficult is it to automate? Does it cost too much, to automate? Are there huge, sort of like risks there? Because that is the case. Like if a robot can do the same job at I don't know, $8 an hour more because of the power it's used or the GPUs or whatever. Like, why would you implement the
Sure.
robot?
Sure.
So that's one. And then the other part of it would be like culturally, are you ready to let, sort of AI take on this task? Is it so mission critical that you're like, I'm just not ready. Right. And I think the great example here, and it's a very common example, is like self-driving cars, right? Like human drivers get into accidents all the time. Human drivers kill people, pedestrians, other drivers, etc. Unfortunately, all the time. But the standard that we hold autonomous drivers to is so much higher because of that like factor, right? And so I think we have some of that too culturally, and for a good reason in these companies.
Do you think that might be generational though? Like if we move a few generations out, I was talking to somebody recently about restaurant tech and how they are automating more and more and more and more and more of the restaurant, and actually the service is being reduced. And it's not necessarily, they're expecting a lot of pushback, and there are people that do push back, but there is a whole generation coming up that actually demands less human interaction and
Yeah.
wants to get their food served to them quicker and don't want someone in the way. Do you think it might be this this issue of being scared of autonomous car? I don't know who's flying a plane. I'm still scared when it's a pilot. I'll be scared when it's a robot. I'm going to be regardless. I can't see him.
Yeah.
I don't know who it is. So do you think that maybe this could be 20, 30 years into the future when we've sort of moved generations, that problem will go away?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, my first gut was to say I don't think so, but we're already seeing that even in like software adoption, right? Our generation who's now taking on, and I'm sure you see this in Olive too, when you have, sort of like a CIO or a VP of IT who is more of a digital native and is like, "Oh, why are we sending these Excel spreadsheets to everyone and then waiting for stuff to come? Like, why are we doing this? Like I can do something on GPT, like when you have people doing that, they're much more likely to adopt versus if someone's either been like, look, this is the way we've always done it, or I want to have my eyes on it, or already spent 100K developing this in-house clunky, solution, and I have to SQL query all my, like those are two different, buyer personas.
Sure.
So that leads me to assume like, yes, of course we're gonna like be more and more open to this stuff, especially as consumers of it, whether that's me being a B2B buyer or, a consumer. The part where I have hesitation is going back to incentives. If it's your job and your job is on the line, you're going to come up with reasons why you can't be automated away. I think that's one. So maybe that you wait until there's turnover and then no one actually wants that job anymore. And then that's when, sort of the transition happens. There also might just be other parts of jobs that you're just not going to want to get rid of. Like, think about I mean, I think you're a great example. Like you pick up the phone, you call people, you text, like you are very communicative. That gets things done. I think it will always get things done. I think about there was I was talking to an electrical components supplier, I don't know, a couple months ago, and he was like, "Man, I just have to teach my people to get on the phone because they're a small distributor. They have to buy from all of these manufacturers don't really pay attention to them because they're, like one of the smaller guys, not one of the, bigger customers. And they're, ordering parts from all over the world. He's like, you just got to pick up the phone, call that factory and say, I need my order. Where is it? And I don't think that call is as effective if it's Siri going, hello, Joe Smith, where are my SKU 106? And obviously, it's better, like the technology is better than that. You might not know you're talking to a human, but I do think relationships will persist. And maybe this is like my okay boomer moment of like the millennial generation. But I do think there are going to be parts of our work that just start to skew more and more towards human, despite everyone kind of like backing away from the human element. You know what it?
Yeah, 100%. I think we got off manufacturing a little bit.
Yeah, it's
But I
hard
love it.
to predict.
It's really challenging. I mean, no one has a crystal ball. I do find myself, I think about jobs like travel agents or, leather makers. I mean, I had a belt made recently. And you think of like a manufacturing line, I could get any belt, but going to someone that got a fresh piece of leather and made a belt by hand, I was willing to pay more. So I think that there will always be a human, no matter what industry it is. My in-laws still go to a travel agent in
Yeah.
Windsor, Ontario, because they like it. They like going to a travel agent. I think that will persist. Um, it's just going to be a lot less, I think. But I love that communication piece. You're right. There is always going to be that human element. It's how much of the human element is necessary. And then I think the other point that you made earlier was about the labor shortage, like the lack of people wanting to work in these roles. It's kind of given a softball to robots in a way. We talk about restaurants have the same thing, right? Restaurants and manufacturing, I think, went through the same issue of labor shortages, and it does give a softball up to say, well, okay, well, there's no one to hire, and if people do want, I have to give a lot more to that than I do with the robots. So I think we're way away, years and years away from it being automated completely. I think the technology is not even there, which is another issue. I think if AI is being invested in more and more, then robotics will continue to struggle because it is expensive. It is capital intensive, I think. So I do think that might be part of it. But at the same time, we are given a few softballs to automation here where, if there's no one to do the job and they don't want to do the job, you can't blame a company for plugging a robot in.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I'm curious as to what you think about this, culturally, right? Because I think the economics of it are a little bit easier to think about. And I would say maybe my general rule here is going to be humans will spend more time on exceptions management versus
Right.
the like rote work. But you mentioned something a couple minutes ago about society as a whole, or like as we get sort of like into younger workers, generations, things like that. I mean, I even see this when I had sort of like partners and I was the associate. Like I would much rather text than like pick up and call, and I assume that is sort of like a continued trend is we move down the age brackets. But I did want to ask what sort of like if you could extrapolate on that a little bit, because I think that's maybe the assumption that I was missing, where I'm like, like it does feel like the human element is persistent, but like maybe it's not. I don't know. How do you think
So
about it?
culturally, I want to live somewhere. I want to make 90s world where everything has a person. I like human beings, and technology, despite being a technologist, I guess, it just scares me in general and what it can do to society. So I'm fully on the like, I would be okay boomered by everybody. I think I'm fully like in that category. I'm more of a boomer than my dad, but as 82 years old, he's on his phone all the time. But um, but that being said, like I do think it's inevitable. We have people dating AI now. Like people are getting AI boyfriends and girlfriends and stuff. And I just think that we are moving more and more into a world where the phone is essentially part of you at this point, right? And we're not far from a place where more than 50% of your socializing is done online. Um, so then if we can create characters that fill those, online bars and libraries and social clubs, then I don't think you would know too much different. And actually, people like to create their own personalized
Yeah.
friends, right? Like those friends aren't going to like agree to go out to dinner with you and then bail. They're not going to, call your names. They're not going to embarrass you, break your glasses when they come over to visit. I'm sure there's someone listening to this that knows exactly who I'm talking about. They're visiting this weekend. But these if you can create that, I can understand why people do want to. And I'm not saying it's necessarily generational, because I do also see like my dad's generation embracing tech more as they're retired. I think they've got
Mm-hmm.
not much else to do, so my dad's now got a bunch of online friends because he's got nothing else. He's not going out as much. So I don't know. Culturally, I'm not for it, but I think it's kind of inevitable that we get down there. But anyway, I mean, pulling it back, I think
Yeah,
this could be like a whole thing on its own. So I want to just pull it back quickly to manufacturing, because we were talking about robotics and how that, how many startups are going in robotics, how many people are actually investing in it. But I'm interested to hear what you see as the biggest trends, aside from just AI. What are some of the biggest trends in manufacturing that are things that maybe people that are listening that are in manufacturing and thinking about buying startups or investing into smaller companies that might be on edge cases where they would normally go with the SAPs? What are some of the most interesting areas that we're seeing people innovate in? Let's stick with manufacturing for now.
yeah. I'm going to be super repetitive. So I'll have two things, but the first one is very very repetitive. Skilled labor shortage driven by retirements and turnover. I think anything that is sort of like collapsing that knowledge transfer period of time, the gap, etc. Really really interesting. That could be full automation, or it could be sort of like capturing the way things had been done and being able to either replicate them with robotics, or, sort of like teach people better, whether it's manuals, instruction, um, exception handling, things like that. And
Maybe
that's
even like an LMS, like even basic LMS functionality, but for manufacturing type.
Yeah, but you can't do a basic LMS the way we think about it in sort of desk jobs, right? Because like no one's gonna write shit down, right?
Yeah,
You're
yeah.
not gonna go through the process of like assembling something, taking a picture, and then like it has to be so native to how you work, where you work. It can't get in the way. Both from a like adoption perspective, but also a safety perspective, right? Like we used
Sure.
to think that like VR was going to be a thing. Like that's so hard. Like anything that blocks your senses in a big way, anything that like disrupts the workflow. This is why I think AI is so interesting. How it's being like natively brought in these applications, because it can take in a lot of different data structures and types and help you make sense of them. So we think about sensors, but really like a microphone is a sensor, cameras are sensor, like you can take in a lot of this data and be able to reiterate it back in useful fashion. You can take in engineering designs and have those sort of more prevalent through the floor. Think about like some augmented reality applications. Might not be a headset, might be a mobile device, but like things that sort of bring what is theory and push it closer to the actual application. I think that side of things is really interesting. And then the other part is like, how do we enable human workers to work more closely with robots? I think it's going to be a long time before we have, like what are called dark factories, or like factories where you never have to turn on the lights because it's completely autonomous and it can run,
Oh, I never heard that term. That's
yeah,
cool.
it's like, because there's no humans, you don't have to see anything, so it's a dark
Yeah.
factory. Which is funny because we used to say like lighting up machines if you like put sensors in that, it's
Yeah.
anyway. all kind of like fun full circle. But in the meantime, we have these like huge robots that could like take your head off, right? How do you make them safe? How do you make sure they're doing the right stuff and humans are doing the right stuff? Are they where they're supposed to be? Is it configured? I think there's a lot on the human tech interaction side. I think safety is kind of like the first use case, but I think there's more and more on like, how do we interact more fruitfully? Because that's going to be like the near medium term, future.
That is really fascinating. So, because robots need onboarding, they need to be trained not to kill. No, hey, don't kill these people. Do this, and then how do I make sure? And how, as a human, do I make sure that I'm organizing that? That is really fascinating, and something that I think will be really prevalent in. Manufacturing is probably one of the industries that has the most heavy investment in machinery, I would say, and hardware from tech versus software. If I think of an insurance company or a bank, it's mostly investing in software, whereas manufacturing, that's pretty heavy. That is, that's really, really interesting. I've got some more. We can go 5 minutes over. We can carry on for as long as you want. But I had one other question I wanted to ask you, unless you got something else you wanted to add on manufacturing.
No. Let's go for it.
Okay, so you've lived all over. I'm really interested. So, as someone that's not from the US, but spends most of my time in the US, from England, live in Canada, have raised venture capital, I've seen different markets, and it's always been SF, right? Silicon Valley, Silicon Valley, Silicon Valley. Then New York comes up, and Boston obviously comes up occasionally, these coastals. And yet, you and I both have experience. I have experience raising capital, your experience working for venture capitals in other areas, Midwest, Texas, etc. I feel like every year, and you posted about this recently, I feel like every year there's a new, Atlanta is the new hotspot for tech, or Israel is the new hotspot for tech, or whatever it might be. It's always a new spot, and yet it always still seems that it's SF. Like, as much as we keep saying every year there's a different spot, it does seem like it's SF. I did read recently that New York has done the most has actually done more AI investment than San Francisco, and they're trying to put themselves as the AI as the AI capital of AI, right? I'm getting to a question. My question is, like, do you think this is going to be a repetitive cycle and SF will sort it out and they'll rise to the top again? Do you think that we'll see a move to a different city in the US, or do you think that maybe there'll be an international hub that could take on Silicon Valley?
Oh, that last question is interesting. I have no idea.
Okay.
So I'll answer that one, right off the bat. That's interesting. I hadn't thought of
Right.
it. Okay, so let's like look at the history. I mean, like the last 10 years of, VC geography. 10 years ago, seed was super local. There were like no Valley investors, even New York investors who would invest, at the pre-seed seed stage outside of their cities. You kind of had to get to like a $10 million check, maybe 20, for like someone to be like, yeah, I'll get on the plane 4 times a year and like deal with Chicago winter, or, like think about the journey from, I spent a lot of time in Atlanta too. Think about the journey from SF to Atlanta. It's like going from Chicago to London, right?
Sure.
Like that's, sort of the breadth of this, this country. But like no one would do it. And that's why you had sort of this like rise of the rest movement come up. That's why groups like Venture Atlanta has been going on for 20 years, primarily as a way to get more capital exposure to, Atlanta at first, and then, now sort of the Southeast. But you really had to make a big push to say, hey, we're here, we're relevant, we're building great companies, we're building big companies. We just don't have the density, right, of the Bay Area, and then, sort of New York. I think through this whole time, Boston has been like, the number 2, but it stayed out of the conversation because, it's primarily deep tech, biotech, it's kind of like known for some other things. And then New York has gone through waves of like, we're the consumer capital, we're the AI capital, like there's sort of like, it has its moments, but it's also always a steady contender. Rise of the rest happened. I think what the venture markets got pretty hot. You started to see all of these Valley firms have like newer partners get geographies where they're like, okay, I'm gonna go visit Austin, 3 or 4 times a year, and that's gonna be my city. I'm gonna find companies there, right? And then you start to see some pickup, especially at the seed stage, and then COVID hit, and it's like geography doesn't matter anymore because everything is virtual, and that was supposed to be like the total leveling of the playing field. We are reverting. Like we're very much reverting back to, these polls. And I wouldn't say we're reverting back to 10 years ago, but we're certainly like reverting sort of back to pre-COVID. What is great, and this is sort of like data from that post that you're referencing. I looked at these sort of MSAs or city center areas. What is it? Metropolitan
hubs, metroplexes,
hubs.
right?
I looked at these hubs and looked at sort of like how much capital is deployed in those hubs and across how many deals. Obviously, San Francisco is sort of the biggest across both of them, but it's like 20% of all deals and 40% of all capital, right? So capital certainly concentrated in SF, and if you count like LA, California is probably more than half of all capital, but like deals, only 20% of deals, right? You think about, I wish I had the numbers in front of me. I think New York is like 15%, right? And like, 12 or 13% of dollars, don't quote me, but it's around there. So it's like, you start to see there's all these other geographies where like a lot of deals are getting done, but like the capital doesn't stack up to the capital concentration in SF. That can mean one of two things. Either those geographies are really, really early, and so you're seeing way more kind of seed fundings relative to the big chunky checks that go into the growth stage, or there's just more capital in California, so those companies are raising sort of bigger rounds at the same stages. We'd have to look at the data to figure it out. PitchBook's expensive. I don't have like plug. Hey, if you need to sponsor someone, I'll rate content for you. But I think there's like a positive and negative to that. Capital concentrated in sort of the Bay Area, somewhat New York, but like deals are starting to spread. Like actual company formation is starting to sort of become distributed or more democratized. So like I think there's pros and cons to it. I am very much a believer of people can build companies where they need to build companies. I think that if you're probably building a dev tool, SF makes sense, right? If you're building something else, it might not. The key is how do you attract and retain talent that's going to help you scale that business. So I think there's a lot of excitement around these other I'll call it second and third tier geographies. It's just like how do we think about the capital concentration side of it too.
Yeah. I mean, when you think about it, really now, where your investor is located is a lot less important than where you're building the company, right? So I can be building a manufacturing tech company in the Midwest because that's where my customers are, but my investors can still be in San Francisco. That's fine.
Totally.
It's not as important. But that's it is interesting the way it's just. I mean, it just swings, right? Pendulum. I think so much swing. There was so much swing in everything in post-COVID. Everywhere, this is the moment for us to do X, and then we're kind of back to pre-COVID now with a lot of things. And it seems like that's interesting. I would love for another time to discuss international because there's definitely it does feel like a lot of companies are able to raise capital that you would normally. And I just speak to UK founders who would normally just run to America to get funded and now don't have to. They're looking in Europe, they're looking in the Middle East, they're looking all sorts of different areas for raising that capital. So it's who knows, but it does feel like San Francisco's just sticky. I mean, I don't know if you've been to San Francisco lately. It's not the most wonderful city to walk around in, and yet it still remains the place. The place to be. So who knows? Well, we've had plenty of time. My calendar went off amateur hour in the middle of it too, but it's been really good to chat. Hopefully we do it again. I'm really excited about manufacturing tech. I love talking about robots. And I'm really scared about the future of the world, 100%. Thanks, Jackie. Appreciate it. It was great to chat. See you soon.
Likewise. Thanks for having me, Chris.
For sure.